Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of MAP Forum. I'm Nagar Roker, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. And today I am delighted to welcome Professor PAMELA Jones, who is a professor emerita of art history at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. And she's joining us today from Boston to share all about her most recent publication, which is a book on celebrating Teresa of Avila. And Professor Jones, thank you so much for accepting our invitation and for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
Of course. So the whole screen is all yours.
All right, I'm just going to put up my PowerPoint.
Perfect.
Okay, sorry. Get that out there. Sorry, it's on the last slide. I will get to the first slide.
No worries at all. We have an hour.
Well, it won't take that long. Sorry, everybody. Realize it was on the last slide. Okay, here we are.
Perfect. Yes, the cover of the page. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nagar, very much for this opportunity to present my new book, which is celebrating Teresa of Avila, the Discalced Carmelites in Italy, and their mission to Persia and the East Indies. It was published by Brill in 2024. In this book, I reconstruct and analyze previously unknown festivities for Teresa of Avila at the time of her beatification in 1614 and canonization in 1622. The dramatic multimedia celebrations were intended to spread Teresa's cult and intensify devotion to her. Whereas many excellent studies have been published about Teresa's own writings and her lived experience in Spain, my book takes a different approach. It centers on the formation of Teresa's papally sanctioned persona, that is, her official saintly persona, and on its dissemination by means of festivities in her honor. Let me begin by sharing the genesis of this project and how it developed over the course of a decade. I'm a specialist in Italian art and Catholic culture of the late 16th and 17th centuries, and my work, especially recently, has focused largely on saint-making and perceptions of holiness. My research method involves total immersion in the archives, with the goal of finding and interpreting a wide range of unknown or underutilized primary sources. This material includes unpublished letters and reports, printed books and pamphlets, paintings and sculptures, engravings labeled in Latin and vernacular languages, and official decrees, papal bulls, and other ecclesiastical literature. In addition, a large body of groundbreaking secondary scholarship informs my work. It's not surprising that Teresa of Avila, the renowned spiritual writer and founder of the Discalced Carmelite order, drew my attention. She was born in Avila in 1515 and died in Alba in 1582. She made her profession as a nun of the Carmelite order, but became dissatisfied with its laxity and sought to reform the order by returning it to its original medieval penitential character. When Teresa died, the Discalced Carmelites were still merely a so-called province within the Carmelite order. In 1593, Pope Clement VIII approved the foundation of a distinct Discalced Carmelite order. The word discalced means unshod. Teresa's nuns and friars wore sandals rather than closed-in shoes. But more importantly, the word discalced bears the connotation of penitence. Teresa and her nuns and friars were mendicants, having no personal belongings and living entirely on alms. Over the course of her life, Teresa founded 19 houses for nuns and 2 for friars. As an official saint, she was the first woman to be deemed the mother founder of both men and women religious. Given that Teresa spent her entire life in Spain, you might well ask what I expected to find in Italy that would advance the scholarship. I knew I would not find records of Teresa's day-to-day life in Spain, nor new writings about her. By her. But Teresa was elevated to the ranks of blessed and saint in Rome. And because of that, I hope to discover documents that would further clarify her saintly persona. As a result, when I started delving into Roman libraries and archives, I focused on the period from roughly 1600, the Holy Year, through 1622, the date of her canonization. Although there were Spanish images of Teresa from those years, relatively few coeval Roman images of Teresa survive. In fact, the most famous image of her in Rome, Bernini's Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, was begun in 1647, decades after the period covered in my book. However, Palma Giovane's splendid Ecstasy of Blessed Teresa, signed 1615, has an important role in my book. It was the first public altarpiece in Rome dedicated to Teresa, and it was made expressly for the Discalced Carmelites. After a few months of research in Rome, I made a spectacular find in the Biblioteca Nazionale that convinced me that I had the makings of a fruitful topic. I found an extraordinarily detailed description of the temporary decorative program, or apparato, created for Teresa's 1614 beatification celebrations in the church of Santa Maria della Scala in Rome. This is the church, and it's around the corner from the Grand Basilica of Santa Maria in Trastevere. The description, more than 100 pages long, was written by the program's designer, the Discalced Carmelite father Marcello della Madre di Dio. Remarkably, it is a sustained analysis of Teresa's authorized persona as an official blessed. I was floored. Despite being a printed book, it was totally unknown in the art historical scholarship. No doubt this was because the book's actual subject is revealed only in line 9, you see the arrow there, of its long literary title. It is not a traditional festival book and has no illustrations. Instead, it is a highly erudite elucidation of Teresa's beatification decorations, which comprised over life-size plaster sculptures, a painting cycle of her life, a host of emblems, numerous Latin and vernacular poems, and even the lyrics of songs. My first publication about Teresa was a concise reconstruction and interpretation of this apparato with an emphasis on the imagery in the church's crossing, which is global in character. There were 4 obelisks, each one standing for one of the 4 continents then known, where the Discalced Carmelites had missionaries. I soon learned that in 1600, the Discalced Carmelite order was subject to a radical change that tied it to Rome. Pope Clement VIII split the order into 2 separate autonomous branches, the Spanish and Italian congregations, with Santa Maria della Scala as the headquarters of the latter. By assuming oversight of the Italian congregation, Clement bypassed the issue of patronato padroado, by which the kings of Spain and Portugal were given the right to control the influx of missionary orders in their territories. The Pope sent the Italian congregation's men to Isfahan, Persia, where they carried out his missionary mandate while serving as ambassadors to promote Clement's quest to form a military alliance with the Shah against the Turks. The alliance was never achieved. But the major point is this: geopolitics lay at the heart of the establishment of the Italian congregation and would continue to be a major factor in all their celebrations for Teresa. These historical circumstances convinced me that what had originally seemed to be a self-contained topic about an important Roman celebration might be developed into a broadly conceived book. That depended on finding additional accounts of celebrations for Teresa's beatification and canonization in the Italian congregation's early foundations in Italy, that is, in Genoa, Rome, and Naples. And you see here in this slide, parts 1 and 2 of my book deal with those centers. However, to do justice to this topic, I had to expand my study to include the mission to Persia, which was the Italian congregation's very raison d'etre. This was a daunting realization because the Italian congregation's mission to Persia, which began in Isfahan in 1607, had expanded to Hormuz by the time of Teresa's beatification and to Goa by the time of her canonization, thus becoming the mission to Persia and the East Indies. So to me, Isfahan, Hormuz, and Goa were terrae incognitae, just as they were for the Discalced Carmelite missionaries who designed celebrations for Teresa in those centers. Fortunately, I did discover further written accounts of celebrations in those centers. The records were sent to Rome because the Italian congregation's headquarters was at Santa Maria della Scala, and all the superiors of the congregation's individual foundations were obliged to submit regular reports to Rome. They are now located in the Discalced Carmelites archive, the Archivio della Casa Generalizia dell'Ordine dei Padri Carmelitani Scalzi, on the Corso d'Italia, just outside the city walls beyond the Via Veneta. Finding these accounts was essential, but in order to interpret them, I first had to understand the precise nature of Teresa's officially sanctioned persona. This required close reading and analysis of published ecclesiastical sources composed in Latin that have generally been underutilized by art historians. These sources relate to Teresa's so-called cause for holiness, a judicial process in 2 stages that was being standardized during this period. The first stage, in which witnesses' testimonies were compiled in Spain, was initiated in 1595 with support of the Spanish crown. After approval in Rome, a second lengthy process was begun under direct papal jurisdiction. The findings, released in a standardized report called the Relatio, are very important, and what they do is this: they provide an overview of Teresa's life, a history of her deeds, a list of her virtues, and an account of her miracles. And so the series of documents in 6 volumes edited by Urquiza, which you see on the left outlined in red, contains all these documents. Most of them were written in Latin. Some of them were originally depositions in Spanish, so he has included Spanish with facing Latin pages. Finally, Pope Gregory XV gave his imprimatur and has issued a canonization bull summarizing that much, much longer report. This is a crucial source that encapsulates Teresa's official persona, and you see those outlined in blue. 2 other highly significant sources were produced to promote Teresa's cause. The first was a Latin vita, or life, of Teresa, composed in 1610 by the heads of the Italian and Spanish congregations, and it is found in Urquiza on the left. The second was an engraved series of images depicting Teresa's life, created in 1613. This series, by the famous Flemish printmaker Adrian Collard, was subsequently issued in numerous editions by the Halle Publishing House. I've used the 1630 edition, and it's important to know that the images in all of the editions are identical, only the dedication pages differ. Collart's series is the major visual source submitted to the authorities in Rome to promote Teresa's canonization. And as we shall see, the print series served as the basis for many visual narratives in Teresa's festive decorations. As an official saint, Teresa had many authorized roles, which are too numerous to discuss here, but are analyzed in my book. Today, I will focus on two themes depicted in many of her festivities. First, she was an active contemplative whose visions were rewards for her reforms. And second, as the mother founder of both the nuns and friars, she was considered the matriarch of a worldwide missionary order. From the outset, the 1610 Vita states in no uncertain terms in Latin, Martha and Mary were together in Teresa. That is, the active and contemplative life were inseparably blended in her. This balance was an age-old Christian ideal and was regarded as the very foundation of Teresa's reform, which bore fruit in the new Discalced Carmelite order. In addition, it is crucial to emphasize that all of Teresa's visions, even the mystical marriage and transfiguration, about which I've already published articles, were considered and understood as rewards for her reform of the order. Today, I'll focus on a vision widely depicted in her celebrations that explicitly makes this point: Teresa receiving a white dress and a necklace with a crucifix from Mary and Joseph. On the screen is Collart's print of this vision. Teresa wrote about it in her own Vita or life. In chapter 32, she began a discussion of her foundation of the convent of St. Joseph's in Avila, the very first of her reformed houses. Then, in chapter 33, she recounted the vision itself, which took place in 1561 in Avila's Dominican church. Teresa wrote that while attending Mass, she experienced a rapture so strong she could not see the elevation of the host nor hear the priest speaking. This is what she wrote. I saw Our Lady and my father, St. Joseph, for they were putting that robe on me. After being clothed, it seemed to me that Our Lady took me by the hands. She told me that I made her very happy in serving the glorious St. Joseph by founding a reform convent dedicated to him, and that I should believe that what I was striving for would be accomplished. Mary said that she, the Lord Jesus, and Joseph would be greatly served by the nuns in the convent, and that I shouldn't fear that there would ever be any failure in this matter. The official 1610 Vita discussed this vision under point 18, titled The New Reformation of the Friars and Nuns. Collart's inscription, which I've given you in English, makes the same point, as does his composition, which shows the vision in the foreground and the construction of St. Joseph's farther back on the right. In other words, Teresa's vision of being clothed in a white dress and being given a necklace with a crucifix is not exclusively about the efficacy of her life of prayer. It's equally linked to her arduous work as a reformer. It shows that she was favored by the vision because she persisted in her reform of Carmel. Teresa's officially sanctioned role as mother of the Discalced Carmelite nuns and friars also appeared in Collart's print series and in festivities in her honor. Although approved by the Pope, this role was controversial. Members of the Spanish congregation regarded Teresa as mother founder of the nuns, but they considered John of the Cross, who had recently died in 1591, to be the friars' founder. However, Teresa's beatification process was already well underway, whereas John's was not, and he wasn't even beatified until 1675. So the Pope and the Italian congregation needed a new saint right away, a holy person who, among other things, would lend prestige to their missionaries in Asia. And Teresa became that saint. Collart shows Teresa standing in the center, arms raised to drape her cloak protectively over kneeling friars on her right and kneeling nuns on her left. Margaret Tüffner noted the resemblance of this motif to that of the Madonna of Mercy and concluded that this depiction of Teresa, quote, in the respectable role of the Virgin Mary, end quote, was a way to mitigate Teresa's role as teacher and founder. Instead, if we read the engraving's Latin captions, an entirely different interpretation emerges. The inscription at the top reads, "She planted a vineyard from the fruit of her hands." The text at the bottom states, "She planted a very courageous vineyard from the fruit of her hands, as the fecund mother of both sexes of Carmelites. The devotion of many peoples throughout the whole world is brought together, and from the beginning, the reform spread to the Indies, that is, to the Persian mission." Certainly, the composition was based on that of the Madonna of Mercy, but the inscriptions pointedly compare Teresa to the Madonna of Carmel. The Hebrew prophet Elijah, who lived near Mount Carmel, was the reputed founder of the Carmelite order, and he had a vision of a cloud, which was later interpreted as a prefiguration of the Virgin Mary and became known as the Madonna, of Carmel. Historically, the Carmelite order arose near Mount Carmel in present-day Israel in the 12th century. Teresa's reformed Discalced Carmelite order retained that reference. In Hebrew, the word Carmel means vineyard. Like the Madonna of Carmel, Teresa was a fruitful mother whose spiritual daughters and sons were her nuns and friars. The inscription statement that Teresa's reform spread around the world insisted upon her global importance. Now let us look very briefly at the chapters in the book in chronological order. And I want to just say that I'm going to give a little bit more emphasis to the mission to Persia and East Indies than I do to the other parts. In part one, about the beatification celebrations in Italy, we have chapter 1, which focuses on Genoa, where the first of the Discalced Carmelites' Italian foundations were located. Maddalena Centurione Spinola, a Genoese noble who joined the order in Spain, was the patron of the nuns' convent and the Church of Gesù e Maria. Although now destroyed, they are marked on this early map. I have reconstructed the decorative program, which consisted of large temporary paintings of female saints in procession who praised Teresa's virtues. The elaborate apparato in Rome's Santa Maria della Scala, which I briefly discussed earlier, is the subject of chapter 2. My schematic diagram on the left shows the intricately interrelated elements of each nave base program. That on the right is devoted to the decorations in the right transept chapel. The imposing allegorical figures at the bottom, approximately 9 feet tall, were made of plaster and painted to resemble bronze. So it was a very impressive apparato. In Chapter 3, we move to Spanish Naples, where the viceroy had a major role in organizing the festivities. The richly ornamented nave bays of the Madre di Dio church included 24 paintings of scenes from Blessed Teresa's official life in the zones marked here with the letters E. They were based on Collart's print series. Significantly, in Naples, Blessed Teresa was marshaled as King Philip III's holy woman, while the papacy and its particular interests were deliberately overlooked due to political tensions between the viceroy and Pope Paul V. Part 2 focuses on Teresa's canonization celebrations in Rome and Naples. For political reasons, Teresa was elevated to the rank of saint along with 4 holy men on the same day in a grandiloquent ceremony in St. Peter's Basilica. Matthias Greuter's commemorative engraving forefronts the event itself under an arch in the center. At the top, outlined in red, are the saints' processional standards suspended from crowns. And on each side are standing figures of the saints surrounded by their authorized miracles. On the left is a detail of Teresa's standard depicting her transfiguration, and on the right is her large standing figure, which combines the quintessential theme of Teresa as author with her transfiguration. This remarkable iconography is interpreted at length. Chapter 5 centers on the grandiose procession of the 5 saints' banners through the streets of Rome following the canonization ceremony. The standards were delivered to the churches of the saints' orders, where further celebrations ensued. The festivities for Teresa in Santa Maria della Scala consisted of elaborate temporary imagery, but a full description is lacking. In addition, Palma Giovane's Ecstasy of Blessed Teresa of 1615, on view in the right transept chapel, was a devotional focal point. When Teresa was canonized, this painting became, in effect, the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, and the chapel was similarly renamed for her as saint. I have given sustained attention to the innovative iconography of this gorgeous, newly restored painting. In Naples, the subject of Chapter 6, ornate temporary decorations adorned the Church of the Madre di Dio for Teresa's canonization. And on the screen, the top right, letter E, is where the Madre di Dio church was. It is the red line leading up to it is the Via Toledo, the main processional route in Naples. And it was this slide shows only a very, very small part of a very impressive, classically inspired procession through the city that was punctuated by triumphal arches bearing Latin inscriptions and temporary altars ornamented by expensive draperies, silver candelabra, and other ecclesiastical furnishings. The viceroy's right-hand man organized the entire affair, in which Teresa was presented as the Spanish crowned saint, again, with little attention given to the papacy. This brings us to part 3, and I'm going to spend a little more time on it than the others. Part 3 is devoted to the mission to Persia and the East Indies. It opens with a lengthy exploration of the missionaries' challenges before turning to analyze individual celebrations in chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 7 delves deeply into the missionaries' negotiations among competing religious and secular authorities while trying to convert unfamiliar extremely heterogeneous communities. The missionaries' extensive correspondence, conserved in the Discalced Carmelites' Roman archive, was published in English translation by Herbert Chick in 1939. His compendium was reissued in 2012. I think that's a typo on the screen, but in any case, with an introduction by Rudi Mate, the great scholar of early modern Persia. Chick did not record descriptions of any festivities, but his crucial documentation allowed me to examine the missionaries' religious goals, language skills, geopolitical struggles, and, dare I say it, their attitudes toward ethnic and religious diversity. Chapters 8 and 9 take us to two centers in Portuguese Asia, Hormuz and Goa, where festivities for Teresa took place. In 1609, due to tensions with the Shah in Isfahan, the Italian congregation decided to send a few missionaries to Hormuz to establish a new foundation in case their men in Isfahan were eventually expelled. Chapter 8 is devoted to Hormuz, a forbidding island in the Persian Gulf with hills of salt and no source of fresh water. Despite this, it was a strategically located mercantile center at the crossroads between Europe, Africa, and India. Soon after the missionaries arrived, the governor-captain of Portuguese Hormuz funded the friary and church of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, which you see in red as letter E on this early map. The subsequent captain, Luis da Gama, a descendant of the famous explorer Vasco da Gama, was the patron of the elaborate beatification festivities. As an example from Hormuz demonstrates, the imagery used in the mission to Persia and the East Indies was similar to that used in Italy, with some iconographic additions. Hormuz had a majority population of Muslims, in addition to Portuguese Catholics and some Hindus and Jews. The missionaries sought to heighten the Catholics' devotion while converting non-Christians. In 1614, Father Leandro de la Anunciación, a Spanish member of the Italian congregation, designed the ephemeral decorations for the Church of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, E on the map, as well as two public processions. In one of the processions, statues of 4 Carmelite and Discalced Carmelite saints were carried on elaborate floats. Saint Angelus of Jerusalem, who did not figure in the congregation's Italian festivities, was among them. Born to Jewish parents in Jerusalem in 1185, Angelus converted and entered the Carmelite order as a youth. He successfully proselytized Jews in his native city and Muslims in Hungary before being martyred in Sicily in about 1222. Angelus's inclusion underscored Father Leandro's unusually open-minded intention to recruit novices of all lineages and faiths, including conversos and Muslim converts, to join his conversionary enterprise. Back in Italy, Teresa's beatification celebrations highlighted her prayers in the cloister for the souls of Muslims. But in the Hormuz procession, Angelus's float was followed by one carrying a statue of Teresa, thereby adding a crescendo to the missionaries' conversionary theme. Despite the momentum that was gaining in the Hormuz mission, it soon came to an abrupt end. In February 1622, a month before Teresa's canonization, the Shah and his English allies laid siege to the Portuguese enclave, sacked the city and drove out the missionaries. They relocated to Isfahan and Goa. With the expansion to Goa, which had actually happened 2 years earlier in 1620, the mission to Persia and the East Indies had been created. The book culminates with the Italian congregation's move to Goa, where the patronage of two successive viceroys allowed them to build the friary and church, again dedicated to Our Lady of Mount Carmel. And they have been destroyed, but I've marked them on this early map. On the lower left, you see the letter A. That's the basic location of the foundation. And on the right is a photo that Kelly Wood kindly allowed me to use in my book, which was taken more or less from the location where the Discalced Carmelites foundation of Our Lady of Mount Carmel was located. And you can see that it's on the hill looking down toward the water. So going this way and here going that way. The church that you see, San Gaetano, has nothing to do with the story, but it's there. In any case, Father Leandro, who created Teresa's beatification festivities in Hormuz, also designed those for her canonization in Goa. They took place in 1623, shortly after news of Teresa's canonization reached the city. Because documentation of the Italian congregation found in the historical archives in Goa starts in the 1630s, I was reliant on Father Leandro's accounts located in Rome. In addition, the Roman nobleman Pietro della Valle, who traveled widely across the region, witnessed and described early phases of the celebrations. One special feature of Leandro's canonization festivities was a poetry contest, soliciting submissions on designated themes honoring Teresa. Scores of entries were received in Portuguese, Spanish, and Latin, and the best ones were incorporated into the decorative program in Our Lady of Mount Carmel, so in the church that was located near A on the map. There was also a grand procession which wound through the streets of Goa, and I reconstructed that. Again, the viceroy had a key role in the festivities, just as his captain brother had had earlier in Hormuz. So you have a family connection here. In Hormuz, the captain was a dagama, and the same was true in Goa. The viceroy was a dagama. They were brothers. In conclusion, in Genoa, Rome, Naples, Hormuz, and Goa, Teresa's elaborate festivities were made possible by the donations of august patrons, both secular and ecclesiastical. By promoting Teresa's cult, first as a new blessed, then as a new saint, these authorities brought considerable prestige to themselves, their cities, and the Italian congregation. The grandiose celebrations made strong appeals to the senses by incorporating fragrant flowers, blaring trumpets, opulent vestments, and shimmering ornaments. In addition, their literary, visual, and musical imagery were intended to delight, instruct, and inspire. By proclaiming the essential qualities of her official persona in the context of local exigencies, the splendid celebrations helped expand devotion to Teresa around the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you for this fascinating talk, and of course, this wonderful and invaluable contribution to this field. And by now, the Q&A is open. So, and we already have a question in the Q&A. So I'd like to invite everybody to write their questions in the Q&A box so that I can read them to Professor Jones. So the first question is by Janice Bell. Thank you for a very clearly presented and rich presentation, and I second that. I missed the name of the painter responsible for the work with an angel in flight about to pierce Teresa with a spear, and the date of the work.
Yes, Janice, thanks for that question. It is by Palma Giovane, and it was dated 1615. It's a painting that, as I said, it was originally in Santa Maria della Scala, but then in the 18th century, the right transept chapel was completely redone in a completely different style. And at that point, Palma's painting was moved to San Pancrazio. Some of you may have seen it there, where it was almost completely black. It had a huge rip in it. Candles must have just, the soot was all over it. And so only a few years ago, it was completely restored by I can't remember the organization, but anyway, it's an organization that restored it. And I really encourage you to go up to San Pancrazio to see it because it's splendid.
Great, thank you. The next question is by Isabel. Thank you for this talk. What, if any, connections do you see between the missionary activities in Persia and in the Ottoman Empire? Is there a Genoese connection, perhaps with the community in Constantinople?
Okay, well, there may be, but the Discalced Carmelites didn't have any missionaries in that area. Their missionaries, I mentioned the Ottomans because the missionaries in Isfahan were sent there to proselytize, but also to help promote Clement VIII's desire to create a sort of holy league with the Shah against the Turks. So there was no, there weren't any missions in Turkey in this era.
Right, absolutely. Yes. So there's a third question here by Franco. Was the male branch of the Carmelites originally under the rule of cloister as the female branch, and thus the Pope later obliged them to be missionaries, something that Teresa never envisioned for the Carmelites? There's a second part to this question, but I'm going to wait.
Okay, let me deal with the first part, Franco. That's a great question. I couldn't get into all that detail, but yes, you're absolutely right. So not only was the Spanish congregation at odds with the idea of Teresa being the mother of the friars, the Spanish congregation was very much against this missionary mandate because Teresa herself had founded a penitential order that was cloistered. And so one of the points that makes the Discalced Carmelites completely different from the Jesuits, for example, is that they observe the canonical hours. So that means they're 24/7. Their lives are based on prayer. It punctuates both day and night. And you can understand how a lot of the nuns remained cloistered, so that wasn't an issue, but how many friars just couldn't conceive of how to do this. And so the Italian congregation, I should say, did undertake the missionary mandate. They had meetings about it. There was a little bit of consternation about it. But on the other hand, the Pope was sort of their patron at this point. And the reason that Clement, chose the Discalced Carmelites to go to Persia was because his confessor, Pedro de la Madre de Dios, known in Italy as Pietro della Madre di Dio, a famous preacher, was his own confessor and was a Discalced Carmelite. and was in residence at Santa Maria della Scala before Clement divided the order into these two congregations. And I should also just say one more thing about it. What happened was when Clement separated the order into two congregations, the Italian congregation was given Asia and Europe except for Iberia. Okay, so it means Poland, Belgium, all sorts of places like that were part of the Italian congregation, whereas the Iberian or Spanish congregation was Spain, Portugal, and then Africa and the Americas. And what happened was the Carmelites, the original Carmelite order, already had very old missions. For example, in Mexico, I think the mission of Santa Alberto, it might have been even a province, I can't remember the date, but by 1550, certainly. So what happened was when the Spanish congregation in the 17th century disavowed any sort of missionary mandate, they gave their old missions in the Americas, and the African ones had not succeeded, but in the Americas to the original Carmelite order.
Okay, fascinating. Thank you. Right, it is. It is. And so the second part of the question, what is the source of the small engraving of the Transfiguration of Teresa, which shows her standing before an altar on which the small angel is standing?
An engraving of that?
Engraving of the Transfiguration.
That's the standing figure of Teresa, standing at her writing desk with her books and her quill, and then the angel of the Transfiguration is coming down with the arrow. That is a detail from Matthias Greuter's commemorative engraving of the canonization of the 5 saints, which Franco, I'm sure you know, the 5 saints included 2 Jesuits. And that's a very, very interesting detail because it combines the theme that I didn't talk about because there just isn't time of Teresa as author, which was another sanctioned aspect of her official saintly persona, even though it had been controversial in her own day, with the Transfiguration. And I can say one thing about that I think is really interesting. The Transfiguration, of course, during it, Teresa's heart caught fire with the love of God. And the flame is very important because the flame, as all religious knew, was the symbol of charity, and charity is the highest virtue. And charity in Latin means both love, in this case, it refers to Teresa's spiritual love of God, but it also means charity in the way we normally think about it, good deeds, and so forth. So at the heart of the understanding of the Transfiguration was not only that it was a sign, again, of the effectiveness of her spiritual life, and it was absolutely, positively a sign of that, but also that because of this love of God, she said in her description something to the effect that when she had the experience of the Transfiguration, which was not just one time, but sometimes, that that Jesus wanted her to know, or God, that her work was really his work. Okay, so again, even in that scene, there were ways that people interpreted it as part of the reason that she was able to carry out her reform. So again, getting back to that combination of the active and contemplative life. They always use singular life because it's supposed to be one life.
Right. Thank you. The next question is by Tiana. Thank you for this interesting presentation. How did celebrations of Saint Teresa in Spain compare to those abroad in the period you are studying? Were celebrations or designs emulated based on correspondence with viceroys or others in Naples, Genoa, Rome, and other managing projects further afield?
Okay, so that I can't answer that question. It's a very good question. I did not work on the Spanish festivities. I mean, I had, I can't tell you how many thousands of pounds of documents I had, but I can tell you something. That would make a terrific topic, another topic. And a lot of those, the descriptions of those festivities have been published. I can't give you the citation off the top of my head, but there have been several compendia of some of them rather old compendia, I think maybe even from the 17th century, of different festivities in Spain. And then, of course, once somebody went through and interpret, if somebody were to go through and interpret those, at that point, it would be possible to make the comparison. But I just don't, I had to cut off this project at some point, or I would die before I finished it.
No,
I'm not getting any younger,
No, it's just like I don't think any project can ever be done without cutting at some point.
Right.
It can just go on and on and on, and everything is just so related. So now that we're talking about this kind of the comparisons, I also have a question. If you found any figural representations outside of Europe, in Persia or in Goa, in Hormuz, Isfahan, Hormuz, anywhere else in Persia, or in Goa.
You mean ones that still exist?
Ones that still exist, or they were reproduced. Somehow they were, 17th century like representations of any of the ceremonies, celebrations, events, or even Saint Teresa.
Okay, well, there is kind of a big problem with finding material like that because, first of all, Hormuz was sacked. So nothing survives in Hormuz. No records, no imagery, no buildings, no nothing. So that is, out of the question. Now, it's interesting about Isfahan. Now, I just should actually point out that I was very concerned with trying to figure out what Teresa's official persona was.
Mm-hmm.
It really has not been something that has been worked on that much. And so actually going through all the documents and finding out what her persona was a foundation because I couldn't do anything with the imagery until I knew that. So because of that, it means that I was working on a relatively short period of time. I ended the book with her canonization, and that was in 1622, but the festivities in Goa took place in 1623. So I just want to make clear that there could be imagery that survives later from a later period. It won't be in Hormuz, but there could be some in Isfahan. Now, interestingly, the Isfahan mission lasted into the 18th century. They were very worried that they'd be kicked out because Shah Abbas I had threatened the Augustinians with expulsion. And so the Carmelites then were thinking, uh-oh, this might happen to us. But I haven't come across anything. And not only that, but I have a section in my book where I talk about religious dialogue. And
Mhm.
Abbas the First, at least for this early period, this is a way of answering your question about Isfahan. Abbas the First was very interested in Christianity, and some of his wives were Orthodox Christians, and he allowed that. He didn't have a problem with that. But he was not interested in converting to Christianity.
Yeah.
So at least with as there were a lot of missionary orders there, okay, and I can only really speak to the Discalced Carmelites. One of them, Juan Tadeo, was a great linguist, and he actually had a lot of interaction with the Shah and served as the Shah's ambassador in Europe and traveled to quite a few places for the Shah. But of course, the missionaries knew that their faith was right, and it was the one true faith. And as several current Iranian scholars have written, the Shah knew he was a theocratic ruler, which is something that it seems that the missionaries didn't really know that. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but just given what went on, it seems that they didn't realize that he was a theocratic ruler. So, of course, he also knew that his religion was the one true faith. So
Mhm.
what does that mean? It means, for example, one of the missionaries wrote that, um, he feared that if there were any novices walking around in Isfahan, they would be in trouble because they would be seen in uh, their robes and so on. So I have not found anything about any festivities in public in Isfahan in this early period. They absolutely would have had some private festivities. Even today, all religious orders have festivities for their holy people on their feast days. So there would have been festivities, but not public ones. There was just too
Mhm.
much tension. Now, were there festivities in 1650, 1720? I don't know. But I'm guessing it is not out of the question that there could be some imagery in Persia of Teresa. Um, in the period that I was working on, the missionaries had no fixed residence. The Shah kept moving them around. So there's no physical place that survives that's associated with them from the early 17th century. So you
Mhm.
would just have to sort of look around. Now, moving to Goa, in the 18th century, the Discalced Carmelites were expelled from Goa. This was the era of, a lot of expulsions of religious orders. There are some stones standing from their foundation, but there's nothing
Mhm.
else. The archives, the state historical archives in Goa has nothing from the period before the 1630s, and that's after the period
Mhm.
I studied. Now, I did go to Goa. Unfortunately, I wrote this book during COVID, so I had a trip to Goa planned and I couldn't go until after. So by that time, the book was already in production. I didn't expect to find anything in Goa because of what I just said, and I didn't. But I did go and look at every church I could look at. There's a wonderful little museum of Christian art in Goa that is state of the art. They have great facilities and a very smart young man who's a curator. There was nothing whatsoever about Teresa there.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it's possible they might have some uncatalogued materials, but there was nothing there. I spent a long time with that. sorry, I can't remember his name, but you know, he was a well-trained person. So I think what might really be found is material from later on. And I should just say, just to put this in perspective, people should remember that the Jesuit order was much older than the Discalced Carmelite order, even though the saints themselves were pretty much contemporaries. So Francis Xavier, for example, was in Goa in the 1540s. When were the Carmelites there? The 1620s. Okay. So what we're dealing with is I'm dealing with a period in which they just barely existed. And they were going out in their first forays into these new areas. And so I don't think we really should expect to find, I mean, even if Hormuz hadn't been destroyed, I don't think we would expect to necessarily find things from the first 5 years of when they were there. To me, it was remarkable that they put so much effort into these festivities when they really, you know, in some cases hardly had foundations. I called the foundation in Hormuz a mission, but in fact, it wasn't really a full-fledged mission yet before it was actually destroyed. So I bet you would find things from later in the century, but not from this point.
Right. Yes. Thank you. And unfortunately, we're running out of time, but we still have one question by Laurie. So if you could keep it brief, and I'm happy to connect you, Laurie, to Professor Jones, if there are any follow-up questions. So the question is, thank you for this fascinating and wide-ranging talk. I'm wondering about the impact of ceremonies in an urban community where many different religions competed. Did the Discalced Carmelites have a long-term presence in Goa?
They did. But again, it's way after my period. So because I was concerned with Teresa, the formation of her saintly persona, which really took place up to, you know, between 1600 and 1620, I didn't pursue later periods, but they were there until the 18th century. There has been a lot of work done on celebrations for Francis Xavier in Goa. And of course, since he was there from the 1640s, there's a lot to work with. But yes, I'm certain that they would have had more festivities. Whether or not those records survive, I don't know. It's working on the Discalced Carmelites is very different than working on the Jesuits. The Jesuits were great, record keepers. There's been a lot of work done on that, their actual record keeping. And they were great self-promoters. And they had very strict rules about what kind of report had to be sent to whom, when, and all that. So if you go, for example, to their Roman archive, and you go in there to work, and you're not really working on the Jesuits, or you're not a Jesuit expert, they know exactly what they have and they know where it is. Now, it doesn't mean that they've interpreted everything, but they know what they have and they know where it is. When I started working on the Discalced Carmelites, they had only one person in the archives. And the archives were open really weird hours because he had to go away in the middle of the day and pray for several hours. He didn't really know where things were, and I'm not trying to criticize him. It's just that the state of the archives was not the same. The new archivist has done a kind of reorganization, which the earlier one did start, and he really deserves credit for that. But it was not as if you could go in. They had a little card catalog. You couldn't just go in and say, okay, I want a record of, Naples in 1647 or something. It wasn't set up that way.
Okay, thank you so much. And I have provided your email in the chat. So if there are any follow-up questions, they can reach out to you directly. I'm also happy to connect anyone to Professor Jones for any questions. Thank you so much again for being with us for the last hour and sharing your knowledge with us. This is a immense work, and a lot of topics are interrelated. So congratulations for this publication, and we hope to see you again in the future.
Okay, thanks so much. It was really fun, and I'm glad to have gotten some really interesting questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great evening. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. Please join us again next week, same time, same link, for another fascinating talk. Thank you again, Professor Jones. Have a good evening.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.